What if the most powerful religious authority in medieval London quietly profited from what it publicly condemned? Welcome to Jayden's History. I'm Jayden, and today we explore the hidden realities of Southwark in the year 1330. If you appreciate thoughtful historical storytelling, please like and share this video, and consider subscribing for future episodes. The visuals you'll see are symbolic images created with AI to make the story more vivid, and I appreciate your understanding if any details are imperfect. I hope this journey offers you a meaningful historical experience and a moment to simply pause and reflect. In the year 1330, London was a city suspended between devotion and disorder. The bells of its many churches marked the hours with steady authority, echoing over crowded wooden houses and narrow streets thick with mud, refuse, and the smoke of burning coal. England was in the early years of King Edward III's reign. He had only recently taken personal control of the throne after the fall of his mother Isabella and her ally, Roger Mortimer. The kingdom was seeking stability after famine, political tension, and economic strain. Yet commerce was growing, and London was becoming more complex, more crowded, and more restless. If you had crossed London Bridge at that time and walked south of the Thames, you would have entered Southwark. This district stood outside the direct control of the City of London. It was a place of inns, taverns, markets, and activities that the city preferred not to regulate within its own walls. Among them were the stews, the bathhouses that increasingly functioned as brothels. They were not hidden in secret alleys. They operated openly under a system that tolerated and taxed them. Here is the moral contradiction at the heart of 1330 London. Medieval England was profoundly Christian. Faith shaped law, time, and daily life. Yet in Southwark, institutions connected to the church oversaw an industry built on what that same faith defined as sin. To understand the brothels of the 1330s, we must first understand this city of belief and compromise, where piety and profit stood side by side. What makes the story of Southwark in the 1330s so unsettling is not simply that prostitution existed, but who controlled it. The district known as the Liberty of the Clink did not answer to the civic authorities of London. It fell under the legal jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, one of the most powerful churchmen in England. This was not an informal arrangement. It was a recognized structure of authority that allowed the bishop to license and regulate the stews operating along Bankside. The same church that preached chastity, confession, and the danger of mortal sin became the landlord of the sex trade in this part of the city. Surviving records from later centuries confirm that rents and fees were collected from these establishments. The system ensured oversight, but it also ensured revenue. The bishop's officials inspected the houses and enforced rules, while payments flowed upward through an accepted financial framework. It was regulation intertwined with profit. The women who worked there became known as the Winchester Geese. The term carried mockery and cruelty. It referred to the bishop's authority and, in popular usage, to the women themselves. Over time, it also became associated with the physical consequences of venereal disease, a reminder of the risks that shadowed their lives. When you consider this title, you can sense how society viewed them. They were both necessary and despised. For many modern viewers in Britain, North America, Australia, and across Europe, this contradiction feels strikingly familiar. Institutions that publicly condemn certain behaviors can still find ways to manage or benefit from them. In 14th century London, this was not hidden hypocrisy. It was an open secret woven into the structure of urban life. The bishop's protection did not grant dignity. It granted control, taxation, and a steady income drawn from women whose moral status was officially condemned. To understand how prostitution became so visible in Southwark, we need to look at the origins of the stews themselves. The word originally referred to public bathhouses. In medieval cities, private washing facilities were rare. Most homes did not have access to large quantities of heated water, and overcrowding made privacy almost impossible. Bathhouses filled a practical need. They offered hot water in large wooden tubs, steam, and a rare moment of comfort in a harsh urban environment. Across Europe, bathhouses had long been part of city life. In London, as in Paris or Cologne, they were places where people could wash, relax, and socialize. However, the line between bathing and sexual commerce gradually blurred. Mixed bathing was common in some regions, and the intimate setting created opportunities for paid encounters. By the 14th century, many stews in Southwark had effectively shifted from hygiene to prostitution as their primary source of income. Authorities distinguished between what were described as honest bathhouses and those that allowed sexual services. The distinction mattered in theory, but in practice the categories often overlapped. In Southwark, the stews associated with prostitution were tolerated as long as they operated within accepted boundaries and did not disturb public order. They were not hidden enterprises. They were known, named, and supervised. If you picture this world carefully, you begin to see how ordinary it must have seemed to contemporaries. A traveler crossing the bridge might enter a stew for warmth or bathing, fully aware of what else was available. The transformation from bathhouse to brothel was not sudden scandal. It was a gradual adaptation, shaped by urban density, economic demand, and a regulatory system that chose management over prohibition. Life inside the stews of Southwark was not lawless. It was tightly regulated under a body of rules, traditionally traced back to the 12th century and still enforced in the 14th. These ordinances, often referred to as the regulations governing the steeholders, were designed to maintain order, protect revenue, and contain what authorities considered a necessary vice. When we read them today, they reveal how controlled and restricted these women's lives truly were. One rule forbade a prostitute from pulling at a man's coat or clothing to attract his attention. Such behavior carried a significant fine. The purpose was not to defend her dignity, but to prevent public disorder and complaints from passers-by. Another regulation prohibited these women from wearing an apron, a garment associated with respectable wives and working women. Clothing marked status in medieval society. By denying them the apron, the law ensured they could never be mistaken for honorable members of the community. The stews were required to close on major religious holidays, with only limited exceptions. This created a visible boundary between sacred time and tolerated vice. Steeholders were warned not to accept nuns or married women into their houses. At the same time, the regulations stated that a steeholder could not imprison a woman for failing to pay her board. On paper, this offered a degree of protection. In reality, economic dependency and social stigma left few meaningful options. What becomes clear is that these laws did not exist to eliminate prostitution. They existed to manage it. The bishop's officials inspected properties, collected rents, and enforced compliance. The women's movements, clothing, work patterns, and even their visibility in public space were defined by regulation. When you imagine living under such scrutiny, you begin to see how exploitation can be formalized through legal language. It was a system that presented itself as orderly governance, yet it confined vulnerable women within boundaries set entirely by male authority and institutional power. Medieval authorities often justified the existence of prostitution through what modern historians sometimes describe as a safety valve theory. The argument was pragmatic rather than compassionate. Churchmen and civic leaders believed that male sexual desire was a powerful and potentially disruptive force. If left unchecked, it might threaten social order, respectable women, or even encourage acts they considered more sinful. In this reasoning, regulated brothels served as a controlled outlet. Writers such as Thomas Aquinas acknowledged prostitution as morally wrong, yet suggested that removing it entirely could produce greater disorder. The comparison was stark. Just as a city might tolerate certain unpleasant but contained activities to preserve the wider structure, prostitution was seen as an unfortunate necessity within a fallen world. This was not approval. It was calculated tolerance. For the women themselves, this logic offered no dignity. They were labeled as public sinners and placed near the bottom of the social hierarchy, often compared with beggars or other marginalized groups. Their work was taxed and supervised, yet their reputation was permanently stained. They could generate income for landlords and officials, but they were denied full participation in the moral community that benefited from their labor. If you pause and reflect on this, you can sense the emotional contradiction. A society deeply shaped by Christian belief framed prostitution as both sinful and useful. The language of necessity masked a structure that depended on inequality. The safety of respectable households was defended, while the women in Southwark carried the burden of stigma, risk, and social exclusion. It was a system that preserved order for some by sacrificing the status and security of others. In the end, The clearest measure of how these women were valued can be seen in death. Despite being licensed and taxed, the prostitutes of Southwark were denied burial in consecrated ground if they had not formally repented before dying. Medieval Christian doctrine held that those living in persistent, public sin stood outside full communion with the church. As a result, many of these women were excluded from parish churchyards. Their bodies were taken instead to a separate plot, known historically as the burial ground for single women. Today, we know this site as Crossbones Graveyard in Southwark. For centuries, it lay largely forgotten beneath the growing city. In the 1990s, archaeological excavations revealed the remains of individuals who had lived on the margins of medieval society. The evidence was stark. A significant proportion of the burials were infants and very young children. Studies indicated high rates of perinatal death and mortality within the first year of life. Skeletal analysis also showed signs of disease and malnutrition, including conditions consistent with tuberculosis, smallpox, and rickets. These findings align with what we understand about poverty and vulnerability in medieval urban life. The children of marginalized women faced extreme hardship from birth, limited nutrition, crowded living conditions, and the spread of infectious disease created a fragile existence. When they died, they were buried in the same unconsecrated ground, separated from the churchyards that symbolized spiritual belonging. If you stand near Crossbones today, surrounded by modern London, it is difficult not to reflect on the silence of that history. These women contributed to an economy that benefited powerful institutions, yet in death, they were excluded from the rituals that defined community and hope in medieval England. The graveyard has become a place of remembrance, not through official recognition from the 14th century, but through later efforts to acknowledge those once dismissed as outcasts. Their story forces us to look carefully at the cost of systems built on tolerated inequality. The brothels of 1,330 were regulated, taxed, and justified, but beneath the legal structure lay human lives marked by stigma, vulnerability, and loss. Crossbones remains as quiet testimony to that truth, reminding us that the most revealing chapters of history are often written not in records of profit, but in the ground where the forgotten were laid to rest. As we close this chapter on 1,330 Southwark, I cannot help but reflect on how history often reveals uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and human cost. For me, this story is not about scandal. It is about the people who lived within a system that judged them while depending on them. The visuals you have seen were created with artificial intelligence to help bring this history into clearer focus, even though they are interpretive representations. I would truly value hearing your thoughts. So please share your perspective in the comments and consider subscribing to Jayden's History for more honest explorations of the past.